Hello there, welcome back. This week we're going to be reading the story The Goshawk and the Brave Lady. And last week we read a story about the Kelpie. And this story is much shorter and might remind you of a little story called Romeo and Juliet. So while I'm reading this story, maybe you can think about how this story is similar to Romeo and Juliet, but has a very different ending. There is some vocabulary in this story, but we're going to be doing it a little different this week. I'm going to be asking you what you think words mean in the story. That way you can use context clues, how they're using the words, to figure out what they mean. The Goshawk and the Brave Lady. This is a story from the Scottish borders. These were once known as the Debatable Lands, when the Scots and the English would cross the border to raid each other's houses and land. Many traditional tales of long ago involve the gallant hero rescuing the fragile maiden. In this story, the heroine, Jean, decides to rescue herself. Jean of Mortonall was in love with William of Aikenwood, and William of Aikenwood was in love with Jean of Mortonall. Good and well, you might say, but you would be wrong. For Aikenwood lay just north of the border in the wild and beautiful countryside of bonnie Scotland, while Mortonall was a few miles south of the border in the fair sweet land of England. And all of this time of this story, the English and the Scots did not get along together at all. They ran off with each other's livestock and set fire to each other's castles and keeps. The border rivers rode up and down the border, plundering and fighting and stealing sheep and cattle and generally behaving badly and causing trouble. Who is the most to blame was anyone's opinion, so I'll leave it up to yourself to be the judge of that. Jean's father, the Earl of Mortonall, had 8 pretty daughters. He had warned them that under no circumstances were any of them to even smile at a Scotsman, far less talk to one. Never in their lifetime would he allow them to visit Scotland, and he said that he would kill any Scotsman who entered through his gates. This caused Jean, who was the youngest and prettiest, much distress and unhappiness. Many months previously, when riding out with her sisters, she had lost her way and wandered over the border and into Aikenwood. She had stopped to let her horse drink at a little stream, and there she had met William, a handsome young Scotsman. The two of them had at once fallen deeply in love. William of Aikenwood was a fine hunter. He rode out each day with his hounds and his horses, his goshawk sitting proudly on the leather gauntlet on his left arm. Now this hawk had very special powers, as well as being a swift and deadly prince of the skies. It could think and talk almost as well as humans, indeed in some cases better. And it wasn't long before the bonny bird noticed that its master was pining away. "What ails thee, sir?" asked the clever goshawk. "I see that your mind is not on the hunt today." What do you think pining away means? "That is true, my bonny bird," said William sadly. "Neither my mind nor my heart is with thee this morn. They are far, far away across the border with my own dear Jean." He sighed heavily as he thought of how they could never be together. "I cannot even speak to her," he went on. "I am not allowed within sight of her, yet I want to tell her how much I dearly love her and wish to marry her." The bird turned its bright black eyes on William and said, "Write out your message, and I will fly straight and sure with it to thine own true love." The Lady Jean was sitting in her flower garden with her 7 sisters when a strange bird came and settled in a nearby birch tree. Jean watched this bird, and it began to sing. First it sang sweet and low, then it sang loud and clear, and as it sang, Jean thought she heard it say her name over and over. "Jean," trilled the bird, "Jeanie, Jeanie, fairest flower of England, Jeanie, bend thy head and list to me, Jeanie, Jeanie, bonny Jeanie." And here is a picture of the beautiful goshawk. Here is a picture of the beautiful Goshawk. Jean stood up, left her sisters, and came towards the branch where the bird sat. "Why do you speak my name?" she asked, and she stretched out her hand. The goshawk fluttered its feathers, and William's message fell to the ground. Jean read his letter, telling her that he would go each day to St. Mary's Kirk near Aikenwood, where he wanted to marry her. He wrote that he hoped she would come to him, and that he would wait for her until the end of time. Jean thought for a while, and then she smiled a merry smile. "Tell your master I will be there," she said, "and that he must listen for the sound of bells." Straight away she went to see her father. "Father," Jean spoke bravely, "you would never allow me to spend my life in Scotland, but would you allow me to spend my death there?" "Daughter," her father replied, "I do not understand your question." "It is not a question that I ask of you," Jean replied, "but a boon that I beg you. Grant me this wish. When I die, I should like to be dressed in a linen shroud and carried forth upon a bier to rest in St. Mary's Kirk." Her father laughed loud and long. "I fear it is you who will be first to see me at rest," he said. "But if it pleases you, then I will grant you your wish." "So what do you think a linen shroud is?" And she asked to be carried forth on a bier. And she asked, "A boon that I beg." Those are 3 words all in the same paragraph that we have to kind of imagine what they would be. What do you think they mean? Jean then spoke to her sisters. "If I should die," she said, "will you make me a shroud of finest cloth? Also, to mark my passing, I would like each of you to fasten a little silver bell upon it." Her sisters tried to coax her away from gloomy thoughts, but finally they promised to do as Jean had asked them. Jean hurried through the castle halls to her chamber. There she prepared a strong sleeping potion and drank it down. Her eyes closed, her cheeks turned pale, and everyone thought she was dead. Look how down in the corner there are some little dogs. Her sister came and stood over her. They could not rouse her. Then they lamented sorely at the loss of their youngest sister, but in keeping with her last wishes they sewed her a white linen shroud, and each of them stitched a silver bell to the side. The next morning they laid Jean on an oaken bier and carried her over the border into Scotland towards Aikenwood. As the sad procession wound its way slowly to the Kirk of St. Mary, all the little bells tinkled one by one, just as Jean had planned. Deep in the surrounding forest, William of Aikenwood heard the bells ringing. He stretched out his arm, and his faithful goshawk flew down to rest upon his wrist. Together they rose swiftly to St. Mary's Kirk. When the funeral party left, William slipped quietly into the tiny chapel. He strode down the aisle and gazed at his beloved Jean. Her face was as white as a lily flower, and her cheek as cold as the snow on the border hills. He knelt beside her and took her hand gently in his own. Then the rosy color came back to her face and lips. She opened her eyes and smiled at her gallant. What do you think a gallant is? "I am happy to be here with you, my love," said the Lady Jean. "As I am with thee," said William of Aikenwood. And I guess they lived happily ever after. It shows a pretty ring here, which I assume would be their wedding ring. And that's the end of the story. So you can see how it's a little bit like Romeo and Juliet. Although In both stories, there's a great sacrifice. To be with the one they love, they end up giving up their family. So it's a hard choice to make. There's a lot of stories based on the borders between Scotland and England. This particular story is from Sir Walter Scott's Minstrel of Scottish Border Stories. So there's a lot more stories about the borders. They're always fighting, so there's a lot of stories about it. But I hope you like this story. And I changed the way we're doing the videos a little bit, so hopefully that helps you understand things a little better. And we'll see you next week, where we'll be reading Whoopity's Story. I'm going to show you the picture so you can see how it's spelled there. So if you want to know what that even is, I guess you'll have to tune in next week. But see you later. Be brave.